guys, it's Nicole and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to do an update on the Dendrobium Nobile orchid. So how to care for the Dendrobium Nobile is one of the most popular videos I have on my channel. So I want to give an update on how that orchid did, how it grows, and I'm going to make it a little bit more short and succinct so that you guys can quickly learn how to care for this orchid. With that said, let's take a closer look and I'll show you how this orchid did. So I got this Dendrobium Nobile orchid 2 years ago. I repotted it in March. So now it's in a clay setup with some coconut husk and sphagnum moss, but this allows it to dry quicker. This is a deciduous orchid, which means that it needs a dry rest period without any fertilizer, and it has a quick growing season in the summer and in the spring. Alrighty, so this orchid has grown a ton since I got it 2 years ago. When it finally bloomed, I was able to see its beautiful pink flowers. Here's the ID that I think it is down here, but it's always nice to see orchids bloom when there are no IDs, especially for the first time. Now this orchid is a deciduous orchid, which means that it grows very heavily in the spring and summer. You'll start seeing new growth sprout with leaves that come in, and it's going to spend a couple of months growing actively. Then when we start hitting the fall and the winter, the orchid starts shedding its leaves. And then during that period, you're not going to feed it as much. So in the fall, I usually taper off the feeding, gradually taper it off in September. By October, this orchid is not getting any fertilizer, and I'm making sure that by not giving it fertilizer, it's going to start working on buds. If I continue to feed this orchid in the winter, it's going to get Keikis because it's going to think it's still growing season. So we need to give this orchid a rest. Some folks think that temperature isn't that much of a factor. I let it get cold temperatures in the winter because I find good results with it, but you can get away with leaving this orchid indoors if you can, if you don't feed it. But I think you get better results if you're able to cool it down. Because I grow indoors, this goes on my fire escape for a couple of months, and I bring it in before the temperatures get below freezing. So this orchid comes in when it's in the upper 30s. Generally, this orchid blooms in the spring when the temperatures are warmer again, but I find that this blooms for me in the winter because I'm bringing it from cold temperatures outside to warm temperatures inside. So this orchid thinks it's spring. But if you're growing this orchid outdoors, when it gets warmer, that's when it's going to start blooming for you. So if you live in Florida or somewhere like that, you may get blooms later on and in the actual spring, whereas if you're growing indoors like me and you have to bring your orchid from outdoors to inside when it gets freezing, your orchid may think it's spring and you're going to get blooms a little bit earlier. You can water this orchid in the winter, but I tend to water it, say, once every 2 weeks. Make sure you don't give it fertilizer. I will reiterate that again because then you might get Keikis. It'll trick it into thinking it's still the growing season. So you want to make sure if you're watering, it gets no fertilizer whatsoever. When buds start developing, and that's typically when you bring the orchid inside, then you can resume watering as normal. No need to give fertilizer yet. You wait until it blooms, but then you can start watering regularly and allow the pot to dry, or you could water as it's approaching dryness. But when you start seeing those buds and those flowers, that's when you want to start giving it more water again. When those blooms are done, like this right now, it's going to start going into an active growth period. So you're going to start seeing little shoots come in. You might get Keikis every now and then. It depends on the Nobile, but if you didn't feed it, you're not going to be loaded with Keikis. But you're going to start seeing new growths pop in. And the canes that are bare from the winter, those shed their leaves. Those are the old canes, but the new canes are going to come in with new leaves. Now, after the blooming is done, that's when you can feed the orchid. So you want to feed your orchid from springtime or after it stopped blooming through the summertime, because that's when we're gonna start seeing new growths come in. I personally have this orchid in a relatively small, tight pot in a clay pot so that it can dry quickly, and it's a heavier pot, so when I put it outside, it's not gonna fall very easily. So this orchid gets a pretty good light. When I have it growing under lights, when it's the spring and summer, I give it Cattleya level light. So it's right next to my Cattleyas, it's pretty strong. In the winter, I let it get, it gets like a northeast facing light. It's pretty strong actually, because in the morning it gets maybe 3-4 hours of direct sunlight, but that's generally fine. But I find that this orchid thrives with direct sunlight. In terms of fragrance, it really depends on each Nobile, but this orchid in particular is fragrant. It's got a nice soft floral fragrance, and I think it's a little different for each Nobile that you have out there. This one is a hybrid, but there's plenty of other Nobile types that may smell differently. I'd say that this orchid is a little bit more difficult to grow because you have to remember to stop watering. It's not hard, but you can't treat this orchid just like you treat any other dendrobium. So Dendrobium phalaenopsis orchids, you can constantly give light, you can constantly feed them. Dendrobium nobile orchids, you have to remember to give it a rest. So I say that this one's a little more difficult because you have to remember that, but by the same token, it's a very simple little change and it's not really tough to remember if you're used to having deciduous orchids. So I put this in the camp of Dendrobium anosmums, catasetum orchids. They're very similar in that you're gonna have to taper off the watering a bit for this, and then you're not gonna fertilize. Now, catasetums are a little extreme where you're not watering at all. This one you can water. I hope this video was helpful. If you have any questions, let me know down below, and happy growing. See you guys next time. Bye everyone.